about just to what extent do you guys think all of these things that we're discussing are a function of basically where you draw the boundary of the self versus universe, right? Because like if the universe is learning about us as we're learning about it, basically like where you put that Markov blanket, right? And it's almost like if you take any random chaotic system and draw some arbitrary boundary in it, and that puts a perspective where all of a sudden we have an agent that, right, like has this, or I mean, of course not any, but perhaps a wide variety, and then from that stand we get all this ingression of Platonic form, things like that.
The direct perception, strong perception ideas of ecological psychology are that you don't really draw the boundary, because rather than having like an organ, it's basically a very sort of anti-dualist perspective, where instead of having like the organism and the environment as these separate systems, perception, cognition, and action in the ecological view are able to happen precisely because the organism and the environment couple together as like organized elements of a single larger system. And then to bring in a little bit of Mike's terminology, what the agent then ends up becoming, the boundaries are its cognitive light cone, sort of the range over which it can perpetuate some agentic dynamics, and anything outside of that. So it's really all about the sort of agency and ability to fulfill a plan that ends up determining the boundaries. And basically anytime an organism is coupling to its environment, it's forming a collective intelligence with it to some degree to perpetuate whatever dynamics it needs to do. There's a preprint that discusses this a little bit that I'll share with me and Mike, and also Leo Pio Lopez in his lab is super smart. So it doesn't go into that specific question in a ton of detail, but does talk about cognitive light cones as the boundaries of agencies. You might find that interesting.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more of, right, that perhaps even, right, like a dancer being part of the group collectively becoming a single unit, or all this, right? Like, to what extent are all these questions kind of functions of this arbitrary divide of what is a self and what is a not self, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and I think that ultimately you kind of have to start with, well, unless you sort of David Chalmers, you have to start with your own sort of self-experience as the most real thing to you, because you are having this first-person experience, and then you go, well, here's a boundary, and I put boundaries around objects constantly, my cup, my water. Where you draw those and whether you draw a boundary, there are people that, you go, oh, I've been talking to a ghost. They've boundaried, a set of air molecules and said, this is an object. Whether or not you believe them, that's coupling, right? And so if enough people couple on an object, and people will throw in validation, because if you're proposing something extreme, you will go and get fought by the rest of the network, because it's computationally expensive for the whole network to couple to this novel object, which only you can see with your sort of specific cognitive light cone. And if that object over many, many validation turns is discovered by many, many observers to be more computationally efficient than that object is actually lots and lots of air molecules, then this is like the co-creation, disingression and co-creation, and upward and downward. You have the sort of some imposition from a macro scale observer. This is like, you also see this in Eric Coyle's work. You have some macro scale description that has causal power, and then that bounds the sort of upward feedback from the network that says, oh, that's real, that's not real. And so over time, you get those boundaries are sort of competitive. Like I did, the idea, the simple phrase is like, ideas are evolutionary, they fight. So when we make an abstract idea, this is literally, what atheism and theists do. They constantly fight about which idea is more stable and sticky. And these things can be applied, I think, up and down scales. But where you take the cut, I think, comes from the fact that we're human-sized and we have this first-hand sort of conscious experience that, you can think you're a zombie, but it's probably not super helpful for you. And that gives you the sort of grounding for all the other objectifications that you do as part of that process.
Yeah, but then there's ritual, right? Which then create these entities that are kind of collectively human-sized, right? Through ritual, we couple it to the superorganism, and now
religion, right?
And now like this God becomes real.
The evolution of religion that way. We have animism. It's the Bodhi tree is the tree of everything. Then we go to it's actually the mountain, bit bigger. More. I think humans, when they do these sort of ritualistic objectifications of things, we tend to like big things. Like things tend to get bigger. And I think it's because you don't just have, when making observation, you don't just look at what you can currently see. You make projections. So you have to, in your internal model, you have sort of two levels of it. You have your current sort of cognitive light cone of what your current computational power says. I can roughly predict this. And then you have an imagination. You go, I think the limit is here, and this is the biggest thing I can aim for. Like, this is my telic goal. This is the thing with the most structured information. And in religion, that manifests as, the ultimate ground. And you have it across every persistent religion, even though each religion has infinitely many different schools and different nuances. The kind of base idea is, there is some fundamental one thing or no thing if you're a Buddhist, but, conceptually it's like, similar. It rhymes. It's not quite the same. But to survive, those things have had, been embedded as the hugest objects that we can imagine, right? Especially the difference between transcendence and immanence, right? You get to immanence and you go, I've got everything that can possibly happen here. And then someone comes along and goes, actually, no, I've got something that's even bigger. It's not even a concept. You can't even describe it. It's unending. And so therefore I have the maximum, I have an unending size of my possibility space. That must have more utility for me in sort of the long run, or it wouldn't happen so many times across the world in all these different contexts across thousands of years. And so these sorts of rituals are like ways of embedding that, where people are getting some utility from that bigger model. And that I think is sort of a theory of dynamics of like the interface as opposed to reality, but the interface might be getting something from it that's useful for it. And so this is sort of my strong view, is that when evolution is predominantly an informational phenomenon, I think survival is downstream of it. I think survival is what things do so that they can keep doing the informational thing. They can keep sort of structuring space, or structuring this possibility space up.
Could I just point out that the ultimate religion that succumbs to that argument, which I concur with exactly, is actually mathematics. That's the one that is most universally endorsed in a co-evolutionary Evo-Devo kind of sense.
I mean,
it's just a story that makes sense. So you use the word bigness. I was reading as inclusive or expansive, whilst at the same time as simple as possible.
Yeah, it has to be easy. Otherwise, no. Like, think about, like, if you think about it computationally, when you have, like, I'm leaning on much more talented people at mathematicians than me. But when I think about like computational possibility space, one of the, I think, neat things within sort of really our formalism is it's a closed groupoid, right? It's an infinite groupoid. There is a closure point, and that imports geometry and physics. And whether or not you think that's the ontological ground, or whether you think it's just the interface or the biggest space to model the interface, that closure point has usefulness, right? It enables that model to take this really big thing, and within simple steps, one, it says everything in that model connects to it by one morphism, one choice, one jump. And so it's instantly, if you've got the communication channel right, it's instantly easy for people to put into their world model, which is the innovation of Christianity, right? You had Judaism, which was like this transcendent God that's too far, you can't touch it. Don't Maimonides, it's nothing. You don't think you know anything about it, just do it. And then Christianity, and that's been baked into sort of rabbinical Torah for thousands of years. But you get to Christianity, and Christianity is like, no, you can mediate through this thing, Jesus Christ. It's a real thing here. That single jump, you couldn't see it. It was too hard to compute. Here's Jesus. Just touch him, and you'll touch him, and he's composed of this point. Actually, this point in infinity is actually a trinity. It's actually three things. So don't worry about it being separate. It's actually the same. Don't worry about it. And so these are the sort of jumps these systems make to compete, right? They compete because for observers like us, they have utility. It's clear. Otherwise, they wouldn't stick around. Ideas that fail, ideas that don't have utility, we're very good at spinning. We're very good at fighting about them. That's all we do constantly in every subject.
So are you saying that Jesus Christ is one of Benjamin's knots then?
For sure. Yeah. I'm saying it. I'm not just saying. I'm saying it in Taoism. I'm saying it in Hinduism. They're all different strategies to sort of get to the biggest possibility space, in my view. You know, the interesting, like, you know, Hinduism pre sort of the Vedantic revolution was like a load of degenerate basins that covered the possibility space in loads and loads of different places. You know, the pantheon was hundreds of gods, and then they were like, oh, actually, we can join up all these degenerate basins with this idea of Brahman. Bang, and suddenly it's universal. And you get these in Judaism, right? You even look at the evolution of Judaism. It's my religion. It's just like you have sort of the Canaanite 70 gods, right? You have El and his consort, I think it's his consorts. Those 70 gods, you see that integrated into sort of prophetic Torah. They're relegated to idols, but we still keep the 70 faces or 70 interpretations of the single book. So some of the idea survives that sort of validation to make it better or stronger. Some of it doesn't. And that's sort of the nature of all these things. And it's why this is such an interesting forum, because it's, you know, people from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds sort of trying to compose the very coupling structures we're talking about in the context of the Platonic space discussions, which is in itself self-similar to the entire dynamic of observation, which is weird because it shouldn't really do that. It shouldn't do that. It shouldn't be that way around. It should be, you know, it's confusing that top-down ideas can constrain what you can think about or constrain what you can do, but it's intuitive in our day-to-day life. Yet we can't find it, or we find it very challenging in a physicalist worldview to make sense of it. And so here we can use sort of observers and, you know, possibility spaces to start to make sense of it. And the job will be to connect that back to physics, right? This is way beyond my ability, but there are lots of very smart people doing that all the time.